On a Tuesday morning in September of 1982, Brian Smith walked into the John Deere dealership with a folder tucked under his arm and a salesman's smile on his face. Kevin Johnson was already there, standing by the coffee station and waiting for the meeting to start. Smith had seen 1,000 farmers just like him, men with modest acreage and old iron that still ran, who seemed to have no ambition to move up in the world. But this time, Smith had a specific plan in mind, because he wanted to show Johnson what real farming looked like. He was going to walk him out onto the showroom floor to see the new 8440, and when Johnson eventually said no, Smith was going to laugh. Brian Smith knew the numbers by heart. Interest rates were holding steady around 9 or 10%. Farmland values were climbing every month, and exports were booming across the country. The government was pushing a message to get big or get out. And Smith had internalized that gospel so completely that it had become his own. He couldn't see any reason why Kevin wouldn't take the loan, and he wondered why any rational farmer would pass up an opportunity like this. Kevin Johnson owned 40 acres and still ran a John Deere 4020 from the late 1960s. That machine was reliable, and it was paid for. But in Smith's mind, it was exactly the kind of operation that was about to be left behind by the modern world. Smith had done the math on 100 farms just like this one, and he thought he knew a weakness when he saw it. When they reached the showroom floor, the John Deere 8440 was sitting there waiting for them. It featured 175 horsepower and a power shift transmission, along with a sound guard cab and air conditioning that would keep a man cool in the middle of August. The price tag read $64,000, making it the top of the line and beautiful in a way that older machines could never be. Smith told him that this machine would let him work faster and cover more ground while handling much bigger implements. He explained that Kevin could expand to 150 acres in 3 years, and he might even hit 300 by the end of the decade. Johnson just listened to the pitch and didn't interrupt once. Smith had already calculated that the operation generated enough cash flow to handle the payments, which was the whole point of the meeting. The dealership was ready to finance the entire thing if Kevin put down 20%, leaving the rest on a variable rate loan. The interest was locked in at 9.5% for the first 3 years, but after that, it would adjust to whatever the market rates were at the time. Smith didn't mention that those market rates could move, and he didn't say that variable rate clauses were becoming standard because lenders assumed rates would stay low forever. The monthly payment came out to $1,200, and Smith had run the numbers 3 times to make sure Kevin could cover it for 10 years if he had to. When the presentation was over, Kevin folded the brochure carefully and asked what would happen if the interest rates went up. Smith actually laughed at the question, giving the kind of laugh that comes from a man who thinks he's just heard the most naive thing in the world. Smith told him that rates weren't going up because the Fed had everything under control. He warned Kevin that if he didn't expand now, he would be priced out in 5 years, especially since all his neighbors were already moving. Kevin thanked Smith for his time and walked out to his 4020 and his 40 acres. Smith watched him go with the kind of pity you reserve for men who don't understand their own future. Subscribe to see the underdog win through character and old iron. Kevin had every reason to be cautious back then because the Federal Reserve was moving to change the rules for everyone. On a Saturday morning in October of 1979, Paul Volcker took the reins at the Fed, and he stepped into a mess where inflation was running at 13 or 14%. Money was losing its value faster than a farmer could grow a crop of corn, and the only way to kill that kind of inflation was to make borrowing so expensive that nobody would touch a loan. The prime rate started climbing that autumn, and once it started, it didn't seem to have a ceiling. By 1980, the rate hit 15.5%, and by the time 1981 rolled around, it was averaging 19%. In June of 1981, the rate actually peaked above 20%, which is the kind of number you don't expect to see twice in a single lifetime. Farm loan rates followed right behind those national numbers. And those variable rate loans Brian Smith had sold to 100 different farmers were starting to adjust. The same loans that started at 9.5% were suddenly hitting 18 or 19%, and some of them even touched 20. Let me tell you about the math, because this is where the situation turned truly villainous for the men working the dirt. A farmer who took out a $50,000 loan at 9.5% in 1980 was looking at $5,000 a year just in interest. By 1982, that exact same loan was costing him $10,000 a year. And by 1983, the interest alone had climbed to $12,000. His annual payment doubled, and then it doubled again. But the price he was getting for his corn wasn't climbing to match those costs. The price of grain was actually falling because a strong dollar made American crops too expensive for anyone overseas to buy. A man sitting on $100,000 of debt suddenly realized he couldn't even cover his interest payments with his total crop sales. And the truth was, he couldn't cover them at all. Kevin stayed on his porch and watched it happen to the people he knew. Dale McKenzie was the neighbor to the east, the one who bought the big 8440 tractor and had those even bigger dreams. And he was the first one to really start sliding. By 1984, McKenzie was forced to sell his equipment at auction just to keep the bank at bay for another month. The tractor he had paid $64,000 for went under the auctioneer's gavel for less than half that price. And McKenzie had to stand there and watch it go because he simply didn't have another choice. 3 more neighbors followed that same path shortly after, because they had all taken those big loans in 1980 and 1981. They had all placed a bet that interest rates would stay low and exports would stay strong. But every single one of them turned out to be wrong. Brian Smith stopped showing up at the dealership in 1984 because the commission checks had completely dried up. Nobody was buying new tractors anymore, and instead they were selling off the ones they already had, trying to liquidate anything with wheels just to stay afloat. While his neighbors were drowning in that rising tide of debt, Kevin's old 4020 was already paid for and sitting in the shed. He didn't have a monthly payment to worry about, and he didn't have a variable rate surprise waiting to jump up on him every quarter. He just had his fuel, his maintenance, and the land he already owned, which meant he actually had a little bit of cash flow. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to keep him moving, and he spent his time watching. By the time 1985 arrived, the foreclosures weren't just a quiet whisper between neighbors anymore. They had turned into a total flood. The government tried to step in with the Farm Bill that year by offering price supports and deficiency payments to prop up the men who were sinking. But the help came too late for the farmers who had borrowed more than they could carry, and the bill itself seemed to favor the biggest operations anyway. The payment caps were set high enough that a 500-acre farm could qualify for way more aid than a small 50-acre place. For a man like Kevin, all of that was just background noise that didn't really change his daily life. He didn't qualify for most of those programs, but he kept a very close eye on the auctions happening around the county. The way it worked was simple and brutal. When a farmer couldn't pay his debts, the bank took the land and the sheriff held a public sale. The auctioneer would stand right there on the courthouse steps and start taking bids from whoever had the cash to stand there. In normal years, a farm worth $150,000 would sell for something close to that amount. But in 1985 and 1986, the value of farmland was collapsing right in front of everyone's eyes. A piece of ground that was worth $1,600 an acre in 1982 had dropped to just $640 by 1987. That represents a 62% drop in value in just 5 years, and it broke the back of the local economy. An 80-acre farm that would have cost a man $135,000 in 1982 was suddenly going under the gavel for $51,000. Kevin's neighbor to the east, the one who lost his big tractor, finally lost his 60 acres at an auction in the spring of 1986. The opening bid was set at $30,000, and when Kevin bid $32,000, nobody else in the crowd even opened their mouth. He won that land because he was the only one with the cash to play the game. By the end of 1986, Kevin owned 100 acres of good ground, and he didn't owe a dime on any of it. By 1988, he had picked up 3 more parcels at different auctions, bringing his total up to 280 acres. When the market finally started to stabilize in 1990, Kevin owned more land than any 3 of his original neighbors combined. He hadn't spent money he didn't have, and he never touched a variable rate loan or bet his future on what the government might do. He had simply worked hard, saved his money, and waited for the right moment to move. When a farm came up for auction, Kevin would bid exactly what that dirt was worth to him right then, not what it might have been worth 5 years in the past. He won those bids because nobody else could afford to stand against him. And he won because he was patient enough to let the other man panic first. There isn't much drama in this part of the story, and you won't find any big newspaper headlines about what he was doing. Kevin just showed up at the sales, placed his bids, and went back to work on the new ground he had acquired. He fixed up the old equipment he bought at those same sales, and he kept saving every penny he could. By 1995, his holdings had grown to 1,200 acres, and by the year 2000, he was farming 2,100 acres. By 2012, Kevin owned more land than the entire county had considered prime territory back in 1982. Brian Smith had left the equipment business way back in 1984 to sell insurance in the city, and he never saw the empire Kevin Johnson built out of the wreckage. Subscribe to see the underdog win through character and old iron. The difference between Kevin and his neighbors wasn't a matter of luck, but rather a fundamental disagreement about how the world actually works. Dale McKenzie and the others in the valley put their faith in leverage, believing that borrowing piles of money to expand was the only way to get ahead. They convinced themselves the government wouldn't let interest rates spike because it would be bad for business, and they assumed exports would grow forever because America was the best at everything. They were wrong about all 3 of those assumptions, and by the time they realized the truth, the trap had already snapped shut. The machines were sitting in the shed, the land was mortgaged to the hilt, and that high interest debt was locked in tight. Kevin believed in something else entirely, focusing his life on the things he could actually see and touch with his own hands. He believed in owning a tractor that didn't require a bank's permission to fix. And he believed in holding land outright without a lender or a variable rate surprise waiting in the mailbox. There were no phone calls from men in suits at Kevin's house because he didn't owe them a dime. He understood that patience was its own form of power, and he viewed waiting for other men to make mistakes as a deliberate strategy rather than an act of cowardice. To Kevin, a handshake deal meant more than any 20-page contract, because a handshake was built on a man's word, which was the only thing that actually mattered in the long run. Now, let me tell you about the machinery, because this is where the real divergence shows between a man who is free and a man who is owned. Kevin's John Deere 4020 was a simple beast with no computers and no software locks to keep him out of the engine bay. If the hydraulic pump failed on a Tuesday, he could fix it himself or call a mechanic he'd known for 20 years to come out and lend a hand. The repair usually cost $300, or maybe $400 if the part was getting hard to find, but the machine was always back in the field by morning. The 8440 that Dale McKenzie bought was something else entirely, being a complex and integrated piece of new steel that was beautiful to look at, but completely dependent on the dealer. When something broke on that machine, you couldn't source the parts yourself, and you certainly couldn't turn a wrench on it without a proprietary computer. Kevin understood this reality without ever needing to say it out loud, knowing that dependency was just another word for vulnerability. By the time 1990 rolled around, Kevin had $150,000 sitting in the bank, while Mackenzie had nothing but a zero balance and a foreclosure notice. The difference between them wasn't a matter of raw intelligence, and it wasn't that Kevin was naturally smarter than his neighbors. It was a matter of pure discipline, and it came down to having the guts to say no when every other person in the county was screaming yes. That one little word, no, compounded over 10 years into something that looked like total dominance over the local landscape. But it wasn't about dominating anyone. It was just the cold mathematics of restraint, playing out over a decade of hard work. There's something in the rural mind that values this kind of quiet victory, because it isn't about being rich, it's about being right. Kevin didn't have a burning desire to own the entire county, but he did want to prove that Brian Smith was wrong about the way the world worked. He wanted to show that leverage was a weapon that cut the man swinging it, and that patience was worth more than blind ambition. He was right about the interest rates, he was right about the danger of borrowed money, and he was certainly right about the value of waiting. When the auctions finally started, they gave him the chance to prove his point to the world, and he took every single one of them. By the year 2012, Kevin Johnson owned 4,200 acres spread across 3 different counties, which is a massive operation by any modern standard. He had the GPS equipment, the yield mapping, and the soil analysis tools that read the ground to tell you exactly what the dirt needs to produce a crop. But the most important detail was that he still owned every bit of it outright, and not a single acre had been bought with a cent of borrowed money. His net worth was somewhere north of $20 million, though I say somewhere because Kevin wasn't the kind of man to advertise his bank balance to the neighbors. He still drove a 1998 Ford pickup with a cracked tail light, and he still lived in the same farmhouse he bought back in 1985 when the auctions were in full swing. He never moved to a mansion, he never upgraded his lifestyle, and he never felt the need to prove his worth to anyone else. That level of restraint was the final part of his victory, and it was perhaps the most impressive thing about the man. Dale McKenzie had lost everything by 1988, eventually moving down to Arizona to work for a construction company until he finally reached retirement age. He never set foot on a farm as an owner again, and 3 other neighbors from that same stretch of road had stories that ended just as poorly. One of them was a man named Peterson, who had borrowed $200,000 to expand his borders before the crash hit. He committed suicide in 1987, walking into his barn one morning and never coming back out, leaving his wife to find him there in the shadows. Another neighbor spent 10 years drinking himself to death, starting with a single beer at lunch before moving to 2, and eventually ending with a bottle on the porch before the sun even came up. His body finally gave out in 1993, which was a slow and painful end to a life that had once been full of promise. A third neighbor moved his family to the city and never looked back because he couldn't stand to see the land he'd lost. He didn't want to run into the men who had bought his legacy at an auction for pennies on the dollar, so he just disappeared into the concrete. Brian Smith actually sent Kevin a letter in 1995 that served as a formal apology for the bad advice he'd given all those years ago. Kevin might have opened it, or maybe he just tossed it in the trash, but nobody in town ever knew for sure because he never mentioned it again. What Kevin had built over those decades wasn't just a pile of wealth. It was a living proof that the salesman's pitch was nothing but a decorated trap. He proved that leverage was a double-edged sword, and that discipline could beat ambition and debt every single day of the week. Younger farmers in the county started paying close attention to how he operated, and while a few tried to copy his strategy, most of them lacked the iron discipline required to make it work. They wanted the land right now instead of 30 years from now, and they wanted the big operation tomorrow morning rather than waiting for the next decade to arrive. By 2012, a new version of Brian Smith had arrived in the valley, this time selling software-locked tractors and complicated financing schemes for equipment that farmers couldn't fix. They offered lease agreements instead of true ownership, and while the pitch sounded modern, the underlying trap was exactly the same as it had been in the 80s. Kevin recognized the danger immediately and went out to buy old iron, specifically the used John Deere's and Case 1H machines from the 90s that could still be repaired by hand. These were machines that didn't lock you out of your own engine, and he didn't need the newest technology because he didn't have any desire to expand his borders anymore. He already had exactly what he needed, and more importantly, he had it all paid for in full. By the time 2012 rolled around, Kevin's name was on the deed for nearly 8% of the entire county's farmland, making him the largest private landowner in a three-county region. He was the same man who had said no to Brian Smith on a Tuesday morning back in 1982, and nobody had laughed at him in over 30 years. If they had tried to laugh, he wouldn't have cared anyway, because by that point, he had already won the game on his own terms. This isn't a story about a man getting rich, and it isn't about some secret financial trick. It's a story about understanding how the world actually works when the rain stops falling and the bank stops smiling. Brian Smith believed in a future that didn't exist, a world where interest rates stayed low forever because he thought the government wouldn't let them rise. He bet that exports would keep growing and land prices would never stop climbing, convinced that his cash flow today would always cover his debts tomorrow. Brian was betting on every single card falling his way. But in this game, one wrong card makes the whole hand collapse. Kevin Johnson believed in the present, and he put his faith in things he could actually touch. He believed in a tractor that ran, land that was already paid for, and the security of cash sitting in the bank. He knew the world was a lot more fragile than the salesman promised, not because he was a pessimist, but because he understood basic math. One man was wrong and the other was right. And now I need to tell you about the trap, because that's where the real lesson is hidden. The farm crisis of the 1980s wasn't some freak accident or a streak of bad luck. It was the inevitable result of men borrowing money they couldn't afford to repay, while interest rates were artificially low. The banks didn't warn them because they believed their own stories, and the government didn't say a word because they wanted the industry to expand. Even the salesmen stayed quiet because they were too busy collecting commissions on every new shiny piece of paint that left the lot. Variable rate loans were the real villains of this era, promising stability while they actually delivered a catastrophe. A farmer who could manage a $1,200 payment at 9% found himself drowning when that payment hit $2,400 at 18%. The math didn't change how hard he could work, but it absolutely changed his ability to survive the winter. Kevin saw this coming because he understood that interest rates are not fixed objects. They move, and when they move against you, they have the power to crush everything you've built. What Kevin did at those auctions wasn't complicated, but it required a stomach made of iron. He showed up exactly when other men were at their most desperate, and he bid what the land was actually worth in that moment. He didn't care what it cost 5 years ago, or what he hoped it might be worth 5 years from now. He only cared about what it was worth right then. He won those bids because he possessed cash and patience, which are two things most men never have at the same time. Usually the men with cash are in a frantic hurry, and the men with patience are completely broke. Kevin had both, and that meant those auctions weren't about luck. They were about being ready when the opportunity knocked. His belief in simple machinery, like that old 4020 he could fix with his own two hands, wasn't just a practical choice. It was a philosophy. A tractor you can repair yourself is a machine you control. But a tractor that requires a dealer and a laptop is a machine that controls you. This principle goes way beyond old iron because it's really about autonomy and refusing to be dependent on institutions that don't care if you live or die. Now, let me tell you about how these small wins compound over time. Kevin's first real advantage came from saying no to Brian Smith, a move that saved him $1,200 every single month. That might not sound like a fortune, but over 30 years, that kind of discipline starts to grow legs. That savings turned into $360,000 over the first decade, and that money became the down payment for the auctions. Those auctions eventually turned into 2,100 acres, and those acres grew into a $20 million legacy. One simple word, no, eventually became an entire county. The real story here isn't that Kevin got wealthy, because plenty of men find ways to make money. The real story is that he was right when everyone else said he was wrong. He was right when Brian Smith laughed at him, and he was right when his neighbors were trading in for new tractors. He was right when the rate spiked and the bank started calling in the notes, and he was still right when the foreclosure notices started appearing on the courthouse door. So that's the system: the pitch, the trap, and the final opportunity. Once you see how those three things connect, winning starts to feel like a mathematical certainty. Kevin Johnson didn't set out to beat the system. He just flat out refused to join it. You should start there. Learn to say no to the things that don't serve your long-term freedom. Subscribe to see more stories about the men who understood the real game and played it on their own terms.